Growing up, I've always heard about Hideo Kojima and his projects, most notably the Metal Gear series, but I never had the means to access his games, especially in a country where finding physical copies for his games was a rarity. And that was until Ground Zeroes was released on PS Plus that I got my first taste of the series, and then The Phantom Pain when it released the following year. And for the next few weeks, I just spent days and nights playing it to the point it almost affected my school performance, which is funny to look back at. One of the things that instantly grabbed me was the gameplay, and having it be my first time experiencing a game with such a large amount of freedom alongside Far Cry 4 definitely shifted my preference in games that give paramount player freedom and how to approach a scenario. 4 years later, out of my parents' house and going to uni abroad and a messy Konami divorce, Kojima was back at it again with his own independent studio, just about to release Death Stranding, and I was there day one, solely based on my experience with Metal Gear Solid V, and having it be my first time playing a game the moment it drops was a magical experience, especially during the pandemic where everyone was sheltered and the general energy at the time was negative. Getting to experience those opening hours, the simple yet rewarding strength system that encourages cooperative play in a non-traditional manner, the way the soundtrack accompanies you throughout your journey, and the tactility of the gameplay itself and how complex it grows over its runtime, you can definitely tell I lived in that world more than I think I did. But looking back at these experiences, I took a step back and pondered, if I enjoy Kojima games this much, how come I haven't played his previous games? There was the obvious reason of finding them out later as I grew older, but other than that, the entire series in this current age hasn't been as readily accessible as one would expect, which is why Konami took the courtesy of porting these games under the Master Collection moniker. In its current release of Volume 1, it features both Metal Gear MSX games, Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, which was a good timing for me because for years now that I've been slowly finding ways to access all games and platforms that were convenient for me, with all of them being the Master Collection version of Metal Gear Solid, the Blue Point HD editions of 2 and 3 and Peace Walker that came out in 2011, and are backwards compatible with the newer Xbox consoles, Metal Gear Solid 4 on the PS3, and then Rising and both V games on PC. Not only did I finally acquire them at the right time, but I was also on holiday from my workplace and filling out paperwork to go back to uni and get my masters, which gave me a ton of free time to get into the games, and with Delta coming out next year, I took the extra step and live streamed the entire series over on Twitch, which you can check the VODs on my archive channel linked in the description. Now that I finished the main saga, and oh boy do I have a lot of thoughts, let me tell you for the next hour how it was finally playing through the Metal Gear series. Admittedly, this wasn't my first time playing MGS1, as I first watched the Christmas playthrough from PlayStation Access back in 2017, which is still one of my favorite playthroughs to rewatch, and a second time shortly after on emulation but never finished it. Funnily enough, so much time has passed that when I finally played it for a third time, it felt like a fresh playthrough, as my mind hadn't cemented most key moments, which made revisiting Shadow Moses Island that much more entertaining. The first two things that struck me the most immediately were the game design and the storytelling. I feel like Kojima is one of the few developers that truly acknowledges the power of video games can provide, not from a storytelling angle, but how interactive the medium is, and as such, being credited as the person who created the stealth genre is nothing to scoff at. As coming from the Metal Gear MSX games, he built upon those ideas and iterated on them again, but now in 3D, where the playing level field is much more complex, with multiple layers of parameters having to be acknowledged given the increase in fidelity on all departments. All of this meaning a dynamic overhead camera as it shifts angles when leaning on walls to spot enemies around the corner, knocking on walls to get their attentions, or differentiating a hollow wall from a normal one, holding a multitude of items and weapons at your disposal, relying on your codec to get information and tips from your colleagues, whether it be during boss fights or general information. Metal Gear Solid is filled to the brim with clever design decisions and that make it feel unique as a game many years later, but it also doesn't shy of breaking the fourth wall sometimes, like asking us to check the number at the back of the cover box. It's definitely not a norm for video game nowadays, as all productions have shifted to emulate that Hollywood cinematic experience. But having moments like this made me more appreciative of what MGS1 in the series were pushing to achieve. I'd also argue Metal Gear Solid wouldn't be as iconic as it is if it wasn't for Yoji Shinkawa's unique and iconic art style, where with few brush strokes and thick lines, he personifies these characters with strong silhouettes and distinct compositions, a style that stands out amongst the crowd. And it's abundantly present in his press material, concept art, and character designs. For its time, the narrative is a sight to behold, because as I mentioned, Kojima was one of the pioneers of this era to really hone in a cinematic storytelling style, with its usage of real-time cutscenes and voice acting on the PS1 of all systems, a console mostly known for mascot platformers and JRPGs. And he doesn't shy away of having some really complex themes that enveloped in the tactical espionage genre, as he makes it work in a short and digestible experience where even if you don't understand the story, you'll still get some enjoyment from the gameplay, but if you pay attention to what's happening, it adds to the experience. Let's compare it to something like a book or a movie, for example. Very long and old established mediums lacking the interactivity with both and length for the latter that keeps people's attention, whereas with a video game, the added tactility of being in that space affords it to experiment with storytelling and game design to deliver a unique experience. Final Fantasy VII, for example, is a JRPG with complex themes of the same nature, but requires that lengthy runtime to tell its story properly, compared to MGS, which is aiming for something more compact. The main goal is fairly simple: infiltrate Shadow Moses and destroy Metal Gear Rex, a nuclear armed bipedal tank, not so different from the MSX games. And from the opening hours, as you submerge from the docks and work your way up to the DARPA chief, in those first 30 minutes the game thoroughly presents an idea of what to expect. But what makes it stand out as we progress is how rich the characters are in personality, ideals, and goals. Foxhound is undoubtedly one of the most iconic cast of villains in the Metal Gear saga, as each boss is not only memorable from a design and personality standpoint, but their boss fights differ mechanically as well, highlighting just how important interactivity is to this franchise. From having to counter Psycho Mantis' powers by swapping the controller port, having a sniper duel with Sniper Wolf on a large open field, or having a cat and mouse chase with Vulcan Raven in a cold storage room. As for our main heroes, Snake, Meryl, Otacon, what have you, similarly to Binary Domain from RGG, everyone fits these very stereotypical roles from the genre, especially for its time, but those stereotypes are used to elevate the characters' personalities into compelling protagonists depending on how you view them.
It's a paint tattoo, it's not real. I was a fan of Foxhound way back, when guys like you and my uncle were in it. None of that gene therapy like there is today. You guys were real heroes.
There are no heroes in war. All the heroes I know are either dead or in prison, one or the other.
But Snake, you're a hero, aren't you?
I'm just a man who's good at what he does, killing. There's no winning or losing for a mercenary. The only winners in war are the people.
If there's some criticism to be levied, it's the controls, as in the first disc, they feel at their most intuitive and smooth regardless of situation you run upon, but on the second disc, especially in the final boss fights, the precision and multitasking needed to swap between items back and forth start getting cumbersome, which led to more frustration rather than giving you the patience to figure out what you're doing wrong. Overall, I had a great time with Metal Gear Solid, a classic that really pushes itself to be distinctive in a market that wasn't as established back then as it is now, and to be seen as the gold standard must have been a privilege, but nothing could have prepared me for what the sequel, Sons of Liberty, would bring. Believe me when I tell you, I'm genuinely obsessed with this game and then some. Throughout the years, my knowledge of Metal Gear Solid 2 pertained mostly to the story, how shocking its plot twists were, and how its themes are relevant in today's society, but without the knowledge of its plot and what it was telling. So for ages I've been curious. Not just that, but given the jump from PS1 to PS2, I was also curious about the evolution of that game design, given the powerful new hardware at their disposal, and similar to the second Armored Core game, What I got was fairly expected, at least gameplay wise. When it comes to the gameplay, MGS2 sticks to its guns most of its runtime, and instead of seeking innovation and drastic changes to the formula, it still maintains the Metroidvania approach to level design with a dynamic overhead camera and item management of weapons and items for its combat design. But instead of stopping here, it seeks to further enhance and perfect those core systems, with some minor additions on the grand scale that have an impact on the moment-to-moment gameplay for both scenarios. A new particular mechanic I was a fan of was aiming and shooting in first person, which at first felt confusing and cumbersome trying to figure out if the game wanted me to face encounters in this way compared to MGS1, but I soon came to realize it's one more tool in your arsenal, and is much more useful when attempting more precise shots, like shooting cameras or aiming at specific enemy body parts from a distance, alongside being able to now run and gun locked in, which is a great quality of life feature. Alongside it, new inclusions such as carrying enemy bodies and hiding them, experiment around the new patrol patterns, collecting dog tags, peeking out of corners, walking slowly, and even hanging off ledges. All these new additions once again seek to contribute to the immersion and encourage experimentation, which is more than I ever did with the first game, especially given the structure. The game is split into two parts, the tanker scenario and the plant scenario. When in the tank, you get to play as Solid Snake, a familiar character as he invites you to get familiar with the slightly modified control scheme and catch up to what you've missed post MGS1, which is undoubtedly a strong opening, and same can be said for the tanker. While small in scope and mostly a tutorial area, what really makes the tanker distinctive is how interactive the entire area is, not just walking around its many varied layouts, but how you do it, and how the designers have handcrafted certain scenarios for us to extrapolate something different every time we get into a particular room. For example, there's the outside area which gives you the freedom to get used to the controls. When you step in, you start recognizing different layouts as puzzles, and how to solve them however you want, and the further you progress, the more demanding the game asks from you, such as a boss fight, disarming bombs, and avoiding an entire squad of soldiers during a lecture, which is nerve-wracking on higher difficulties.
Especially those with submarine and...
Really? Oh, I was hoping it was a game over. I'm curious now. Oh, it's a game over.
Respond! Snake! Snake!
Then you have the plant scenario, which is where the pistons start turning into full gear. I have no doubt when I say that after finishing the Metal Gear Saga, Big Shell remains one of my favorite locations, not just in a series, but in gaming as a whole, and it's due to how simple it is and how strongly it plays into the Metroidvania component of the game design. Each strut is unique, containing defining rooms with defined rules that force you to think differently as you enter them, alongside the connective bridges. Not just that, but being able to hang off ledges pushes verticality into the mix, where some areas can only be accessed by cleverly figuring out how to get to them, which brings more dynamism to the level design. There's also Raiden as a character, a new rookie coming off of virtual training in a highly dangerous mission that sees him tasked to rescue the president. But as we all know, things are not as simple as they seem to be, and that's what's great about Raiden. Raiden as a character represents us, the players, a blank state protagonist constantly confused with no clue nor enough personal motive to act of his own accord, someone with no agency basically. And from that perspective, it helps us understand how much more depth the many philosophical and political themes the narrative tackles, such as the mimetics, the idea of passing our culture to the future generations not bound by blood, the digitalization of information and how it enables malpractice through misinformation, and the act of free will in a postmodern world, which scarily enough is what's happening in our current zeitgeist. MGS2 is currently my favorite story in the entire series, not just because of the set themes it tackles, but how it structures itself into telling that story. In its first hours, the game gives you the impression of Solid Snake taking the lead role for this adventure, and for a while there's no reason to think otherwise, as the lengthy tank segment leads you to believe it. But when starting the plant scenario, that's when you notice Raiden, and how he will literally carry the game onwards until the end, which at first it's pretty smooth sailing, But after meeting the president, the narrative starts to become thick as we are introduced to the Patriots and their intentions of controlling the collective conscience of the populace through controlling the context of the narrative, whether it be through accurate or inaccurate information. And if that wasn't enough, we also face a new group of villains, namely Sons of the Patriots, which is not to be confused by the system itself. It is a terrorist group led by Ocelot and Solid Snake, and their newly added unit, Dead Cell, who just like Foxhound, consists of a group of unique individuals with their own quirks. At this point, I was more than engaged with the story, as seeing its ambitious scale in comparison to the first game successfully execute many of the ideas it established, which made the third act even more impactful, where conventionality flips itself and the meta commentary becomes absurdly engrossing, unobtrusively breaking the fourth wall constantly to get its point across. Raiden's past as a child soldier, Colonel being a construct of GW.
Raiden, turn the game console off right now.
What did you say?
The mission is a failure. Cut the power right now.
Solid Snake ulterior goal of taking on the Patriots as the former president of the United States within Sons of Liberty, his very own group. I am being genuine when I say it was, at this point, the story started cementing itself as not just one of my favorite stories in games, but also a landmarking achievement in storytelling as a whole, as it serves as a very cautionary tale for a future to come, and pushing gaming as a medium for more extreme design ideas and raise people's expectation of what games can do. At one point, I can't deny the tone was starting to wear me down, as the more insidious the discussion became, the more hopeless I felt.
Human memories, ideas, culture, history.
Genes don't contain any record of human history.
Is it something that should not be passed on? Should that information be left at the mercy of nature?
We've always kept records of our lives, through words, pictures, symbols, from tablets to books.
But not all the information was inherited by later generations. A small percentage of the whole was selected and processed, then passed on. Not unlike genes, really.
That's what history is, Jack.
But in the current digitized world, trivial information is accumulating every second, preserved in all its triteness, never fading, always accessible.
Rumors about petty issues, misinterpretations, slander.
All of this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
It will only slow down social progress, reduce the rate of evolution.
Right. You seem to think that our plan is one of censorship.
Are you telling me it's not?
You're being silly. What we propose to do is not to control content, but to create context.
Create context.
The digital society furthers human flaws and selectively rewards development of convenient half-truths. Just look at the strange juxtapositions of morality around you.
Billions spent on new weapons in order to humanely murder other humans.
Rights of criminals are given more respect than the privacy of their victims.
Although there are people suffering in poverty, huge donations are made to protect endangered species. Everyone grows up being told the same thing.
Be nice to other people.
But beat out the competition.
You're special. Believe in yourself and you will succeed.
But it's obvious from the start that only a few can succeed.
You exercise your right to freedom, and this is the result.
But Solid Snake at the end giving a speech towards Raiden, and subsequently us, the player.
There's no such thing in the world as absolute reality. Most of what they call real is actually fiction. What you think you see is only as real as your brain tells you it is.
Then, what am I supposed to believe in? What am I going to leave behind when I'm through?
We can tell other people about having faith. What we had faith in. What we found important enough to fight for. It's not whether you were right or wrong, but how much faith you were willing to have. That decides the future. The Patriots are a kind of ongoing fiction too, come to think of it. Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide. You can find your own name. And your own future.
Decide for myself?
And whatever you choose will be you.
I don't know if I can.
I know you didn't have much in terms of choices this time. But everything you felt, thought about during this mission is yours. And what you decide to do with them is your choice.
You mean start over?
Yeah, a clean slate, a new name, new memories. Choose your own legacy. It's for you to decide.
And as a result, Raiden removes the dog tags with the name we inserted at the start of the game and swiftly tosses them aside, which the act in and of itself serves as a commentary in our relationship with Raiden, and how in the end he closes to act upon his free will and no longer needs us to control him. And it lifted this huge weight off my shoulders, and it made me feel hopeful once again. I love when games make me feel that way. By the end of it all, and still to this day, I'm genuinely dumbfounded that this exists. As beyond storytelling and game design, this is one of those rare games that proudly embraces its strengths and doubles down on intrigue, complexity, and ambition. Kojima's a madman. Snake Eater sort of represents a big shift the series has seen up to that point, both narratively and mechanically. As for the first 4 games, we've been playing a Solid Snake, and seeing himself be built up as the legendary hero we all know and love. So instead of looking for a way to further that narrative, the developers decide to spin the clock backwards and shift focus to Big Boss himself, Jack, or by his codename Naked Snake, as we witness his journey on what granted him such a legendary title. And it's a very compelling journey. Not just him, but also gameplay revisions that seek to differentiate Naked from Solid in terms of tactics, and further diversify the game design into guerrilla tactics, one man versus an army approach that works really well with the newly designed mechanics, as well as the environments that enable you to experiment said mechanics on. So let's deep dive on that for a bit. For me, part of the appeal of Snake Eater's gameplay is the environments. From the dense and populated Soviet jungles, the arid and mountainous lands of Krasnogorje, to the heavily patrolled walls of Groznygrad. It may sound as though the game is limited in variety, but in keeping tradition with the previous entries, the selling point within them is the interactivity paired in the new game mechanics to make each moment as engaging or more than the last. And you feel it in the first hours of the game, as you're slowly introduced to these new systems and how crucial they become later on. Stamina and hunger, for example, dictate your performance in combat, as the more hungry you get, the less steady your aim becomes in first person, for example. Camouflage allows you to wear different outfits and face paints that closely match with the environment you're in, so enemies have a hard time recognizing you. An injury system where you can finally stitch and patch up Naked Snake, as leaving the injuries linger for long prevents your health from regenerating, and undoubtedly, the most important of all, CQC, which allows you to drag enemies without knocking them first to any direction and interrogate them for additional info. And said additional info varies a lot. It could be highlighting enemy positions, ammunition and ration storage supplies, which you can destroy either or both to leave enemies either hungry or with less ammo. And you can get an assortment of radio frequencies, which on my playthrough I only found 2, one to call off enemy backup.
This is HQ. Control here. You're under fire. Commencing alert status. Acknowledged. Sending reinforcements. Use extra caution.
This is Patrol. The area is clear. Recommend discontinuing the state of alert. Over.
Understood, Patrol. Backup units will be withdrawn. As per standard operating procedure, this frequency will no longer be used. Out.
And another with music you can unlock your journey. While the story as a whole didn't do it for me, as I just came off from MGS2, it was nonetheless an enjoyable experience, as the intro sequence oozed that James Bond coded energy sung by the ever-electric Cynthia Harrell, which, funny story, she actually was in my stream while playing the first hours to watch my reaction. At first I thought it was a bot, but Then I found this tweet from her where she mentioned she likes watching streamers playing the game for the first time, which caught me by surprise. And the more we talked, it was undeniable it was actually her, and it was one of the coolest moments on stream. But back on track. The strongest quality of the writing is undoubtedly both Naked Snake and the boss as characters and their relationship. Something beyond romantic or motherly, something that transcends the core concept of love and mutual respect. A connection only the two of them share that is very core to their motivation and how they both interact with each other. And a strong concept that carries across the narrative. I was completely enthralled every time she was on screen. I really do love her character. But I can't say the same for the Cobra unit. And it was at this point I feel like villains in the MGS series from upwards became less compelling, and most of their unique gimmicks were used for gameplay mechanics. Respectfully, the Cobra unit is nothing more than a bunch of freaks. Kojima freaks, might I add. You battle against, and some of them do benefit from that weirdness to deliver some great moments, like the Pain who uses bees to attack you, the Fear and that weird ass tongue as you try to pick him out of the densely trapped area you're both in, or the Sorrow, which I can't deny was a cool boss for encouraging us to think outside the box and look for alternative methods to escape him. And it was also served as a unique storytelling device to show just how much of your violent behaviors, or not, are reflected in that moment. But looking back, and the more I think about the Cobra unit, the less connected I felt and the less I cared about them. And narratively, they feel very vapid when you compare them all to either Vogan or Joy. If anything, most of the screen time they have is relegated to either aiding both or when you face them for the first time, which is such a stark departure when you compare them to Foxhound or Dead Cell, who had infinite more personality than the Fury of all characters, for example, who I bet you can't tell me anything about him just exclusively using information the game gives you and not relying on wikis. If more than anything, I think Snake Eater really nails on replayability, and I was discussing with a friend how the game essentially feels more gamey thanks to these additions when you compare it to previous entries, as part of the appeal before was for the items you'd earn for completing multiple runs, like the bandana for infinite ammo or the tuxedo suit, for example, where here, you're not just for the higher ranking in items, but also to experiment around the varied system and mechanics Snake Eater has going for itself. And with Delta Remake coming out with a control scheme similar to MGS-V, that would be, for me, the definitive version to play, but only time will tell. Looking back, Guns of the Patriots is a game of many sins. It's not perfect nor is it bad, and it certainly doesn't sit in the middle, as so many elements are playing this fierce tug of war on who receives the most attention. You got the wonky game performance, which to be fair, it's the PS3 fault, which can't be ignored thanks to the newly revamped gameplay that modernizes the controls and brings it close to more standard third-person shooters. Or you have the cutscenes, which are the lengthiest in the series, but have some of the best pacing and writing for an entry that's aiming to conclude the saga. And for every useless number of weapons you can earn throughout the game with a currency shop moreover, it also helps to drive in the point of war becoming an economy. Do you see what I mean? MGS4 has lofty ambitions as an entry to wrap up the modern continuity and close all loose threads it left open or unanswered from previous games. But in the search of doing so, it falls onto many traps that come associated with this attempt, and miraculously enough, the final product itself is competent, to the point where you go back and watch the MGS4 behind the scenes documentaries and realize just how arduous development was, and ultimately wonder how the whole thing didn't crumble itself.
それとそうですね。でも全部今のままやってたら上がらないと思います。
だからね、こんだけ上がってきましたっていう、それやり方がおかしい。
やり方おかしいんですよ。そう
更新の仕方がおかしいから、それ直さな進まへんやんか。そういう議論ないもんだって。最後はできませんって言ったらしまいやんかだって自分で。
When I started playing MGS2 and 3, I had to bump the difficulty on easy because the control scheme was starting to get to me, and other games tend to have questionable design choices that make you pull your hair out sometimes, like the hardness battle I was having with Metal Gear Rex on the first game, for example. So when coming to 4, I proudly bumped that difficulty up to normal, which is what I usually play on, and the little time the game allows me to play it, I was having a blast. Given Old Snake's age in the century, the game design saw some revision yet again to accommodate a new playstyle, and what they came up with is very ingenious. Instead of facing combat head-on, you quite literally become a snake and slither your way through an active war field between factions, and this is exacerbated by the new Psyche bar that lowers the more stressed Old Snake gets, even in cutscenes, which is endearing.
But now you're just too damn senile to face the truth. Wake up and face reality, Old Snake.
And the new Octo Camo suit that automatically matches different camos according to the surface you're standing still, and when combined, both generate some of the most interesting push and pull moments the game has to offer, more prominently in the first 2 chapters. One addition I'm still perplexed at, it's the Dragon Point system, a new weapons dealer character that lets you buy weapons, unlock ID locked weapons, which I'll explain in a minute, and attachment to said weapons. Generally, all main entries so far had a curated set of weapons you could use, find, and use whichever at your own leisure, unless necessary on a later chapter. And you'd be sure to make use of all of them throughout your playthrough, but with 4, you have exactly 70 weapons at your disposal, including grenades, mines, so on and so forth. And for your playthrough, you'll probably use 10% to 15% of all of them. The game doesn't make an active effort in encouraging you to make use of all of them, especially when you consider the linearity of this game compared to the Phantom Pain or Peace Walker, where the deployment phase met said amount makes sense. So the only occasion I see this large amount being useful is in subsequent replays. It's not just the Dragon Points, but there's this weird disconnect between the story and the gameplay itself, where the gameplay to cutscene ratio wildly shifts. Take Chapter 1 and 2 for example. You got these expansive active war zone sandboxes to get through, which is the game at its most inviting for experimentation. From Chapter 3, you have a tailing mission and a chase sequence squeezed in between lengthy cinematics. Chapter 4, my favorite, where you revisit an old but familiar place, and then Chapter 5, which is a very short final confrontation followed up by a 71-minute cinematic. And depending on how you view that, it is very jarring for a series that has both the gameplay and story working with each other. But here I get the sense that Kojima wanted to go more open and varied with the mission design and deliver this epic and enthralling story alongside it. But along the way he struggled to find the needle to make both those ideas work in tandem, and couple it with the development struggles the project was facing, this is what we got in the end. The main narrative is carried by a theme that has been consistent for all our characters, a continuation of MGS3 scene, defined by where a person was raised and how they formed their ideologies based on their circumstances, and the newly discussed sense, as I interpret it, the will of a person and how willing they are to further execute their actions to achieve their goals, and how both intertwine. The Patriots, war as an economy, control of information, familial disputes and what have you, all come from misunderstanding, starting all the way back from Snake Eater and how the misinterpretation of the will of an important figure led us to the position we see ourselves in. Old Snake's rapid aging is the result of his recessive genes thanks to the Les Enfants Terribles project. Raiden's body modification is a result of the block trauma as a child soldier coming back and struggling to make sense of himself as anything other than a war machine. Vamp's immortality is due to Naomi's custom-made nanomachines. Johnny's certified shitter status remains undisputed. Everything is inherently linked to the moment Zero and Big Boss misunderstood the will of the boss after her death, and with Zero as a founding father of the Patriots, it led to so many of the ramifications we see developed in this series, and all of it is poignantly showcased in this game, which is one of his strongest feats. And for such a dark tone, The story fortunately never loses sight on its goals, nor does it ever stoop low for shock value, and has the perfect amount of humor and bright moments to not dilute the main focus.
What's one more smoker?
This is a no smoking flight.
Easily the most disappointing aspect of the story is the Beauty and the Beast unit, or BB for short. This is the shallowest writing I've ever seen in this series, and what bothers me the most is that there is some missed potential. I genuinely see the vision because the implications it reaches shows that there were ideas that had to get chopped the most likely to meet a deadline, which wouldn't surprise me. So the BB unit is a squad not so different from Foxhound or Cobra unit, with a unique selection of individuals with supernatural abilities. You have the commander Screaming Mantis, Laughing Octopus, Raging Raven, and Crying Wolf. And if you haven't clocked in yet, these are clear references to the Foxhound unit in the first game. If said group adopted these names, then there has to be a reason for the parallels to be obvious, but no, there isn't. Once you defeat them in battle, Drebin calls you for each one and just lore dumps their backstory, which makes the act of carrying insignificant, because at no point does the game showcases them prominently other than the intro, and throughout the game you get little to no interactions with them to get an idea of their personalities and how unique they are, other than the very cool designs they sport thanks to the ever magnum Yoji Shinkawa. So when you get to learn their backstory, you really don't care because the story hasn't even invested itself to properly develop them, which is a shame. What isn't a shame though is how this being the last canonical entry in the series at the time meant fan service, and not the type for the sake of hype, but one that enriches the experience, and having played the first Metal Gear Solid game up to 3 in such a short amount of time still made me feel nostalgic. Replaying the opening of MGS1 followed by Old Snakehead morphed into his PS1 model to then arriving to Shadow Moses Island and re-experiencing those moments, seeing returning characters we haven't seen in so long like Meryl and Naomi, piloting Rex and having a mech fight with Ray, the final boss with Liquid as the game shifts through its past, I definitely appreciate it, and it colored me surprised when I went on the internet and found out that many people feel like it ruins the storytelling. The one argument I can agree with is with the BB unit because the depth they receive with those names is non-existent. But other than that, I could see no other reason to detest the rest of it, but hey, freedom of speech, am I right? Kojima has made it obvious multiple times that he wanted to wrap up directorial duties on Metal Gear Solid since the first or second game, but each time he attempted to leave, he would end up roped back into it by circumstances out of his control. MGS2 was due to the popularity of the first game. MGS3 was because no one wanted that director position. And with MGS4, fans, and I use that word loosely, even resorted to death threats when a new director was set to replace Kojima. But at this point, Kojima made sure that it would be known that this is the last time he would develop a Metal Gear game, but it wasn't. So, after 4, as Peace Walker was in co-development, Kojima simply decided to write the story to make it clearer for younger audiences, as the PSP was its main platform focus. But his ambitions grew bigger, and as he kept writing, the more he developed for a 5th entry altogether, a plot line set to further extend the story of Big Boss from MGS3 and in part Portable Ops to the original Metal Gear MSX game. So much so that Peace Walker was internally known as the 5th entry in the series, which explains how staggered the story feels between this and the next 2 entries. On the gameplay front, Peace Walker is a prototype of what the Phantom Pain would eventually adopt, and in this pursuit of embracing more player choice, most of the known design tropes the series has seen are ditched for something more complex and elaborate. First, you have to manage the mother base. As Big Boss seeks to further develop and grow his private militia, we're handed the controls of how to manage it, and it's one of the best aspects it has to offer. You can manage personnel by assigning them to different units like combat or intel, developing weaponry and equipment you make use of in missions. You can send troops into global missions through other ops to level them up or attain new material, and even develop your very own Metal Gear, which is deployed in other ops. What makes base management addicting is its simplicity, which is in part due to the PSP hardware limitations. On MGS5, management was more time consuming as the longer playtime required additional systems to make it functional in the long term, but here it's just menus, assigning people where to go, developing items, sending whoever has to go elsewhere, rinse and repeat, and it works, never feeling repetitive nor annoying. When it comes to replicating the actual Metal Gear experience on the go, much of the core of what makes Metal Gear has remained intact, but due to, again, the PSP being a handheld device and it being targeted at a younger audience, they had to also take that aspect into account, with missions being much shorter and bite-sized and taking no longer than 10 minutes, and each being distinct enough to make gameplay engaging. And part of that design philosophy suffers a bit when playing the HD edition, as the addition of the right analog stick makes the game significantly easier, almost like breaking the rules, and as a result the enemy AI reacts slower, for example. One significant addition to the gameplay is the full-taunt system, which allows you to send incapacitated to stunned soldiers back to the mother base, so they become your stuff and further aid your cause, which in turn encourages playing non-lethal more, as we can clearly earn a ton of benefit from it. The game also features co-op play, but I'm not sure if the servers are still active or not because I couldn't find any active servers on the Xbox 360 version, nor do I think the PS3 version is that much easier to find, which is unfortunate, as that seems to be one of the best features of the game, and I even saw some clips on YouTube of people slingshotting their teammates, which looks insane but not out of place. My one point of contention is the boss fights, and I cannot imagine how frustrating they must have been on the PSP, because Kojima finally puts the Metal Gear name into work, and every major boss are mechs with varying degrees of difficulty. The further you progress, the more difficult they become, and I swear, every time I started a new one, my mind was already thinking of giving up, because the engagement just wasn't there for me, and the fights being either boring, tedious, or way too long than they need to be. If Snake Eater didn't do it, I think this title cemented my preference for Big Boss above any other character, and it's thanks to his characterization. This game takes place post-3, and much of the runtime is spent on him coming to terms with the boss's death, and trying to contextualize her will, which for him, he believed in establishing militias of soldiers that could not be used as tool of the government the same way he and the boss were during Operation Snake Eater. From there, we see the development of the military Sun Frontier, and Big Boss being once again embroiled in a geopolitical conspiracy that seeks to disrupt the already tense atmosphere of the Cold War. Some of the new characters such as Huey, Lovelace, and Paz were cool additions, as they all had an influence on Big Boss, either big or small, and returning characters who are more fleshed out than when we knew them, such as Kazuhiro Miller, were a great inclusion to have, especially for people who haven't played the second Metal Gear MSX game. This may actually be the first Metal Gear game where I struggle to connect with the overall plot, and even though I tend to love character-driven stories more, MGS2 still had a huge impact on me, and 3 undoubtedly left a great impression as well. But with Peace Walker, if you ask me to describe what specifically happens in the story, I could maybe get away with some key moments, but not the overall moment-to-moment story beats like I can do with the other games, which is why I'm more comfortable saying that I played PW for Big Boss's journey than whatever was happening in the background. Part of it could be the motion-drawn cutscenes, as they felt less effective for me on transmitting that message, but in general, I just found some of the new villains like Hot Coldman or Vladimir pretty forgettable, and I do grasp some of the story themes such as AI, the concept of peace itself and how everyone sees it, and nuclear deterrence, but once again, the delivery of those just didn't do it for me, and I'd much rather have those be delivered in massive exposition dumps like 2 and 4 instead of hiding them in cassette tapes if they're that crucial. This is such a minor complaint, but I really do feel like having David Hayter and Christopher Randolph voicing Big Boss and Huey respectively feels wrong, from a personality standpoint. Both are tremendous actors, but their voices are so recognizable for both Solid Snake and Otacon that having them voicing their older counterparts almost feels like cosplay in a way, and the same goes for Snake Eater. There's no distinction, even with different voice fluctuations. While I can't think of an actor for Huey, my preferred pick for Big Boss would be Richard Doyle, who voiced him in MGS4 and, funnily enough, the Fury in MGS3, and have him as well for both Ground Zeroes and The Phantom Pain, instead of Kiefer Sutherland, because Richard's voice has this very rough, monotone and disillusioned tone that perfectly fits the hero to villain path of Big Boss quite well.
Let it go, my son. I'm not here to fight.
And it's such a missed opportunity they didn't capitalize on that after 4. Even though Rising doesn't bear the solid name in its title, Kojima still considers it canon, and while I understand that, I also gotta push back a little. The first time I played Metal Gear Rising was years ago, sometime after The Phantom Pain, and at the time I had no context of the Metal Gear lore, its mechanics, and any other quirks that makes the series what it is. I was just 16 years old, I had my goopy goblin gamer brain fully engaged, and in front of me was a game made by Platinum Games, who is a developer I love dearly. Go play Bayonetta, by the way.
Don't fuck with a witch.
The appeal to me then was the frenetic action, the vibrant soundtrack, and the ludicrous set pieces. I was able to follow the story with no problem, but it's been so long that I lost most of the context before the replay, so it felt refreshing coming back to it in a sense. And boy oh boy do I have opinions and takes to lash out now. Mechanically, this is no different from other Platinum games. They have this core set of design philosophies that works for them, and it's the reason for their games being as unique as they are. In Rising's case, it's about translating that Metal Gear essence into the character action genre, and for the most part, it works. Raiden, for example, being a cyborg allows for the gameplay to be a lot more flexible with the combat, as both light and heavy attacks are quick and snappy. Combos extend your attack patterns and additional weapons further expand your moveset. The coolest mechanic to make it distinct is Zandatsu, which allows you to go into a blade mode and slash anything into pieces with accuracy. It's a very well thought out system brought from when Rising was still a prototype at the hands of Kojima Productions. The gameplay then forces you to always remain in the offensive, as grabbing enemy spines refills your health and your special meter. It lets you dismember enemies after dealing a certain amount of damage to incapacitate them. And for boss fights, they're used to highlight some of the cooler gimmicks each boss employs. It's unique. The only weird thing is the parry mechanic, where you need to flick the stick and attack in the enemy's direction, which is an odd choice, and personally one that does not work that well. You see, there are two things in conflict with parry, which is 1. The game encouraging experimentation for higher ranks, but also needing to be careful when to time your parry, and 2. The camera, a very erratic one in tight spaces, as the direction you flick the stick towards is affected by where you're positioned. And if you can tell by now, that's a recipe for disaster, as the inconsistency throws you off guard in the most opportune moments, and it completely affects the way you interact with combat. Thankfully though, the game features a combat assist mode that lets you parry regardless of the direction, and it made my replay much smoother and quicker than the first time I played, as it's always been the one mechanic I struggle with. Aside from action, there's also an attempt to replicate some of the core stealth mechanics for the mainline games, and for the most part they got something working here, it just isn't perfect. You got different grenade types, cardboard boxes and the like, and certain segments allow you to go stealthy and deal with enemies one by one. The only problem is that the stealth is at odds with the combat mechanics. Raiden as a playable character is built for those highly volatile combat scenarios, so much that even the movement system is in accordance to that playstyle. So whenever you try stealth, it feels awkward because Raiden's inputs aren't that precise, and trying to be quiet 100% makes it more of a chore than actively engaging. Narratively, this is pure fanfiction. This being a sequel, especially after the perfect send-off Raiden received at the end of MGS4, destroys most of the arc he went through. This journey of further succumbing to your worst thoughts and becoming the worst version of you always envisioned yourself to be, and from there, working your way up to redeem you and start fresh. This is similar to MGS2, but that was more about gaining free will than facing the song head-on and winning, whereas here, Rising disregards much of that notion and puts Raiden back into action. First off, I have to say that in terms of continuity, a sequel is bold, given the ending of MGS4 with the destruction of the Patriots AI, and subsequently the chokehold it had on the economy of war, and having Raiden exacerbate the points that wars are cyclical but just with different parameters, in this case private militias that spun off of after MGS4 with their own ideologies and ways of conducting businesses, is a sensible transition. However, bringing back Raiden breaks that new family man arc set up for him at the end of 4 by putting him back into conflict and having the in-game explanation be that it was bound to happen due to his nature as a violently inclined person and how hard it is for him to go to a new normal. This may be the game's way of telling you're bound to regress into your old ways when you fall back into previous bad habits, but god damn it, I just don't like the idea of perfectly wrapped characters being brought back for a reason that isn't as compelling as his 2 previous outings, especially for a story that does not reach the heights of the previous games. Which is why I suggest Rising as fanfiction, because if you take it as its own self-contained story with no links to anything, I would have nothing to complain about. Things like the characters, the villains, which are all cool, and the themes it tackles for what they're attempting to do here, it's solid, no pun intended. But just like Peace Walker, I just can't take this story seriously. I like how it leans into camp and it's constantly shifting between comedy and seriousness, but as a Metal Gear story, there's nothing here, and they might as well make this into a new IP because there's no relevant connecting tissue. In all honesty, I have to make it clear that my main beef with the story is due to how much I like Raiden and how much I loved seeing his development in MGS2 and 4, so bringing him back will always be a point of contention, and I would much rather prefer they went with the original prequel script of rescuing Sonny from Area 51 than whatever we got. Picking up from Peace Walker, Kojima finally applies that encyclopedia he wrote into something more grand and ambitious, that goes on to establish the mechanical and narrative tone we're set to experience in this new mainline entry. But as game development goes, the Phantom Pain was not only getting delayed with quite the frequency, but also going over budget. So Kojima decided to split both GZ and TPP, as they were initially meant to come out together. But my personal assumption is that they wanted money to mitigate the development costs, as it was being sold for $40, and I'll explain that later. So here comes Ground Zeroes, a part tech demo for Fox Engine demonstrating some of the unique visual features it was bringing to the table, and part demonstration for the newly expanded gameplay formula from Peace Walker, set to embrace more player freedom than ever before. The 2 things that Ground Zeroes nails immediately is being a tutorial in the grand scheme of the game design, and how the level design pushes you to experiment. For both your main op and side ops, all events occur in Camp Omega, a large prison complex with quite a varied topography like refugee camps, jail cells, an airstrip, armories, so on and so forth. What makes it work as a location is how incredibly dense and full of occasions and opportunities the map is filled with. Multiple entrances, different enemy patrol routes, weather effects, time of day. The game offers you so much replayability under different scenarios to keep you entertained and encourages different ways of approaching a problem, which is why having Ground Zeroes as a standalone release makes it work so well. Mechanically, this is a continuation of some of the ideas brought by MGS3, like camouflages and CQC, combined with the other additions brought in from Peace Walker. for something that actively encourages player freedom. As much as I love the first 3 MGS games, the controls can be a bit of a struggle in the first few hours, MGS 2 and 3 especially. MGS 4 standardized the control scheme to something more modern, but also make it work with existing Metal Gear verbs, and V perfects it by adding so much nuance to movement and lethal to non-lethal combat options that it represents the gameplay as the best in the series. And while it may not feature the base management or the Fulton system, both the level design and the gameplay mechanics are focusing on helping you familiarize with what you'll be experiencing for 50 to 60 or more when finally reaching the Phantom Pain. The narrative picks up right after the end of Peace Walker, where Paz is defeated and goes missing, as well as Chico as we later come to find out. So Big Boss infiltrates Omega Camp to rescue both of them. Say what you will about the little amount of story we get from this game, but if one thing's for certain is how dark and grim its presentation is, which is an interesting contrast with the comedic elements the series is known for being more toned down. It's the type of narrative that's not afraid to get graphic when it needs to, and some moments can either make you feel squeamish, shocked, or repulsed by the intensity of the imagery. Prisoners having their Achilles tendons bolted so they can't walk, Paz and Chico's extreme torture and recounting of such, Paz's entire bomb removal scene. It's a lot, and if you're not ready for them, then I'm sad to tell you the game does not pull out its punches either. Speaking of which, the game introduces the new enemy unit, the XOF, which serves as Cypher's covert strike force. At this point in the story, little is known about them and their true intentions, including their leader, codenamed Skullface. That is, until the destruction of MSF, where both Big Boss and Millers plot revenge on them, which we'll obviously have to wait for TTP for our answers. Shifting gears for a bit, I feel like Kojima is not the type of person I would expect to drop demos willy-nilly, as I feel he strongly values the final experience, and hopes everyone gets to experience something at the same time. But in the case of Ground Zeroes, you really have to question how difficult the development of MGS-V has been as a whole. For the first time in the studio's history, they co-opted a new development style, including multi-talented developers from all over the world, in a campaign called Development Without Borders. The entire game was being developed alongside Fox Engine, which can often be a pain when certain toolsets are undeveloped yet. Kojima Productions LA was established, as that team focused on developing Metal Gear Online 3, so the more you look into it, the more you realize this project was growing at a scale unseen before, more than MGS4, and Ground Zeroes as a product felt more of a way of recouping some of those development costs to keep the ball rolling for a little while longer, hence the $40 price point, launch in comparison to the amount of content you're getting. And that's a whole can of subjective worms depending on who you ask.
V has come to.
V has come too.
Having finished the Phantom Pain for the second time after my first playthrough back in 2015 really helped put into perspective some of my favorite aspects of that initial playthrough, as well as noticing just how fragmented of an experience this is. And it's a conflicting thought to be sure. Part of what makes this entry compelling is the link that fills in the gap between 3 and Peace Walker into the Metal Gear MSX games, and for such a gargantuan task, you'd have expected extra attention to be placed in the narrative to carry out that idea. But moving into an open world and still trying to tell a compelling story through this new vehicle lays bare some of the challenges that Kojima Productions faced along the way. But let's start with the positives first. As this was my second playthrough, this time I wanted to have fun, so I bought the PC version and installed some mods that introduced some quality of life features, some funny ones, and one particular mod that changed my relationship with the game. Meet Infinite Heaven. Infinite Heaven is one of those mods that goes to the root of the game and gives you access to an in-depth number of variables to alter and modify as you see fit. This could be as simple as giving yourself items, increasing health percentages, and swapping playable characters to changing the enemy's AI, altering patrol patterns, increasing interactivity in Mother Base, teleportation by markers, which I made extensive use of for the Cylops, altering weather conditions, skip helicopter rides at the start of the new missions, and so many others that lets you tweak for a more customizable experience. But I do have to preface that this is the type of mod that's ideal for a second playthrough, as your previous knowledge helps curate the settings that you're liking as you go. Alongside it, I also added my own custom soundtrack and broke some rules to include some music beyond the late 80s like Japanese city pop, soul and R&B like Sade and Sylvia St. James, who I wish I could play, but I don't want this hour-long video to be copyrighted. Gameplay-wise, we already got a bite-sized experience with both Ground Zeroes and Peace Walker to an extent, so most of the surprises were already out there, but many more are exclusive to the Phantom Pain that only works in a way that enhances and elevates the experience to some of the best and tightly designed tactical espionage action the genre has seen in a minute. First, you have the base management, which is expanded, and as you level up each department, tasks can be as simple as unlocking new items to develop, to each one having their own distinctive roles. The combat unit, for example, can be played in the main and side ops, as well as being deployed on outside missions for resource gathering, defenses, rescue, and more for GMP. Base development expands the size of Mother Base. R&D develops your equipment. The Intel unit provides you with intel in the field, and by now you get the gist of it. Everyone plays their role eloquently, and the more you level up the units, the smoother the operations become. There's also FOB missions where you can invade different players' bases and steal personnel and resources. I'm personally not a fan, to be honest, so I never engaged that much with it, even when I played it at launch. Once you're on the field, what happens there is up to you, ranging from how you get to the location, how do you sneak in and deal with the guards, how do you complete your objective, and how do you get out. This core loop is no different from what came before, but what the Phantom Pain does is increasing the amount of choices you're offered compared to previous entries, and the shift to an open world further exacerbates some of these changes, like calling in air support, having your buddies fight alongside you and requesting equipment without having to go back to the deployment menu and further waste resources. Once you get used to these new changes and additions, the smoother the experience becomes, and the more efficient you are during your operations. And if you want proof, go check out the countless What 2000 Hours of MGSV Looks Like videos of people just thinking outside the box and really flexing their creativity within the game rules, which is all thanks to the game pushing even more for systems-driven interactions, in an effort Kojima said to allow the players to tell their own stories, and the hierarchical depth it offers is bar none. Ever since I finished the game, I've been thinking about the story pretty actively and grasping what it attempts to tell and do, not only listening to the tapes but also making the connections this game does to other Metal Gear games, and watching video essays online breaking down the contents and some of the themes and how impactful of an influence they have in the series ethos, and not gonna lie, I'm very mixed about this. If there's one thing that the Phantom Pain fails is in its delivery of the story. The game is split into 2 chapters, and the bulk of many important plot points and threads are in the tapes, a system carried over from Peace Walker, and if you don't take the time to listen to them, you are missing some crucial context that is labeled as additional but nonetheless important in clarifying what is happening. To me, this reads as an attempt into giving the players a choice between shifting their attention to either the gameplay or the story itself, which is not a new approach as we've seen it in many other open world games with documents as collectibles to expand on the lore. But the trap the Phantom Pain falls onto prevents any sort of synergy to be had for any entry in the series, known to flex its storytelling strengths fully through both the gameplay and the narrative seamlessly, and adjusting to the idea of it being absent here takes some time to get used to. While I may not be a fan of how the story was told, I've been more fascinated by the idea of what it could be and the small traces we have already in the game. So the major theme this time is about race and revenge, and how the latter can have one loses humanity, but to an extent, deception is also a major theme that interweaves across the narrative. We're not explicitly told until the end, but the clues are in plain sight to be found, and when you do, you start making sense of the shattered illusion you're living in. Before knowing Venom wasn't BB, why did BB have unremovable shrapnel lodged in his brain when in MG2 and MGS4 BB didn't have them? And this is a small one a friend told me. Why does BB lights phantom cigars when BB explicitly said he likes the authentic stuff in PW?
Wanna try one?
Nah, I'll stick with cigars.
Yeah, but
I don't like imitations. The real thing's always better.
It's the small stuff that adds up over time, and by the time you notice, you realize you're experiencing a delusion and everything becomes much clearer. And similar to MGS2, it employs the notion of Venom as a character to be a commentary on the player that contributes to the legend of the big boss, but where MGS2 succeeded thanks to its linearity and tightly told narrative, V takes some time to get to that point across in the fractured manner they went on about telling the story. Alongside the story, V further cemented, again, Big Boss as my favorite character in the franchise. While I got to meet and experience how great Solid Snake's escapades are, witnessing the shift of Big Boss killing Joy, misunderstanding her will, and slowly transitioning from a hero to villain has been a very compelling journey, and said transition is enhanced by Venom Snake not being BB himself, a phantom as Zero describes him, which not so much shows how implicit BB is in Venom's action, but more so the fact that they're the same person by identity dissociation, which from it, he builds this clouded perception of how Venom believes BB would react to a certain situation or scenario. There's also Miller, who inconsequently contributes to said actions due to how vengeful he's left after the destruction of MSF and the subsequent torture he endured from the Russians. And Ocelot, who under Zero's puppet steering, acts as this middleman who plays into the facade of Venom, and subsequently we get a very welcome expansion upon the character we end up meeting in the first Metal Gear Solid game. I feel like I could go on and on about my thoughts, even talk about how unfinished the game is and how some crucial cut content like Mission 51 is out there for the world to see, but my main takeaway of this replay is this. I miss just how much the core gameplay loop is, and using the Infinite Heaven mod, which allowed me to cut the helicopter travels and had some extra quality of life features, made an already great game even greater. And for the story, I gain a newfound appreciation for many of the elements and ideas it puts forth, as well as establishing links that provides context to other entries in the series. And my one wishful thinking is Konami letting this name finishing the game when he could. While playing through the mainline series and them being my exclusive focus, I also managed to sneak in some spin-off projects out of curiosity because they looked interesting, and since I wasn't able to include them in the main body of text, I thought I would just quickly go over them. Ever since I started playing MGS1 back in the day, I won't boot up the main game before firing up a quick session of VR missions. VR missions in essence are tutorial missions, not just for how to sneak, but how to also use weapons and tools, each at a high level degree, with more complex final missions to cap it off. What I really love about it is that they got this mobile gaming type of design where it's easy to boot it up, play a few levels, and then back out whenever you feel like it, and in turn, it makes me keep coming back to it occasionally, as in total, the game has 300 missions, and to this day I've never beaten all of them, so I get that incentive to keep coming back for more. It's actually a shame VR missions hasn't become a mainstay in all entries because the further the series evolved, the more the controls felt like deciphering a Rubik's Cube, especially MGS2 when they introduced first-person shooting. And speaking of which, 2's VR missions really expanded on those ideas, and 4 just had a standard blank space with guns to try on, but elsewhere nothing of it. I wouldn't even mind a basic firing range with some basic military training for MGS3 for example, that would have been pretty cool, but by the time we get to MGS4, the controls feel so modernized that the need for VR missions doesn't seem that necessary. And plus, 4 went through his own development woes, so it's easy to understand the exclusion of more complexity. These are very early hours and I haven't been able to invest much time into it due to my other obligations, but Metal Gear Acid has been on my radar for being a tactical turn-based game, like XCOM or Mario and Rabbids, and from the little I played I really enjoyed my time. Granted, the first few hours are very slow because everything is being tutorialized and the world building being established, but regardless, I had a great time with it, and it is the type of game I'll be playing on and off again to kill some time. MGS4 database was mostly out of curiosity, as the selling pitch was it being an encyclopedia of everything up to MGS4, from plot points to characters and lingo. It was an interesting proposition, but at the same time, it also marked by hardcore fans for having inaccuracies that either didn't make any sense or were straight up lies. So for the last Metal Gear stream, and with the knowledge of the Phantom Pain, me and my viewers went through it just to make the connections, and it was a valuable experience. The database covers the MSX games and all the mainline entries up to that point, including portable ops, which low-key made me regret not playing it, and it includes an encyclopedia, a timeline chart, and relationships chart, with later content locked in until you have a cleared save data from MGS4 to unlock it. Only problem was the database has been delisted from PSN, and the only way for me to download it was by sailing the high seas, but upon getting it, it didn't work, most likely due to the saves being region locked, as my physical copy was an European copy and my database app was an American copy, so I had to put up with it and just explore as is. The timeline chart details events stretching back to the philosophers in the 1700s up to the modern day 2014. And going through it, you notice a ton of real-world historical events, like the Manhattan Project, Apollo 11 included, and they're interwoven with the Metal Gear fictional timeline to influence some of the events back and forth. In all honesty, reading through everything, it felt like there's a ton of info not needed or just there to fill in space. But overall, it was great coming across Metal Gear lore and making sense of facts I have forgotten or simply didn't know. There's also a relationship chart which, similar to the timeline, it'll present you a graph of characters and their relationships as the timeline marches, and it also shows the type of relationship these people had and how they evolved, which was really insightful. What makes accessing both of these charts fun is the inclusion of highlighted words, as you can seamlessly read the definition of terms, the description of characters, equipment, events, organizations, what have you, and it took about like 2+ hours of just scrolling and taking it all in. I hope Konami considers bringing it to Volume 2 of the Master Collection, and update it by including information of Peace Walker and V, while also updating some of the mistakes and interweave both entries into the existing structure of the database itself. I'm so glad I can finally put Metal Gear Solid as one of my favorite gaming series alongside my many other obsessions, and to have someone as special as Kojima and his team crafting these experiences is nothing to take for granted. Curiously though, as I went through the series and had my friends who are fanatics to discuss with me about Metal Gear as a whole, we kept discussing some of the mechanical geniuses the game often employs, the compelling narratives, and the whole ethos of the universe, and eventually the future of the series. I'd say right now is the perfect opportunity to be a Metal Gear fan, as most of the staff at Konami that made those stupid decisions are long gone now, and the current members are making an active effort to not only preserve the series for years to come through remakes, ports, and remasters, just like what Silent Hill is going through right now, but also explore the possibility of a new entry without Kojima. And as controversial as this opinion may sound, I really do believe it is possible to make a new entry without Kojima. It'll be hard, but not impossible. And the fact that Kojima ever since MGS 1 to 2 wanted to give the directorial role to another staff member further cements my opinion. Where and when it'll be set is hard to envision, but for now, my ideal scenario is the best path forward after Delta would be to remake both MSX games and combine them into a single game, because both games together are 7 hours long. There's a ton of mechanical depth to be included as well as invented, and the breadth of Metal Gear lore available means a more fulfilling experience that bridges all threads seamlessly. So if this video inspired you to get into the series, by all means please do, because regardless of how fluctuating the quality can be at points, These are some of the best video games the medium has to offer, and it's the type of experience you could not have any other way other than games. That's what makes them special. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe, share with your friends and activate the bell so you can get notifications of my latest video, and thank you for watching.